to today's open lecture at MCC, where former war correspondents Todd Bensman and Julius Strauss will discuss the nature of political Islam and Islamic terrorism. My name is Anita Somyu. I'm a student at MCC School of International Relations. It is my honor to briefly introduce to you the experts of the subject. Todd Bensman. He is an investigative writer and senior fellow for national security at the Texas-based Center for Immigration Studies. Before joining Homeland Security, he worked as a reporter for more than 20 years. In the early 1990s, he covered the Gulf War and later from Prague, Eastern Europe, and the Transnistrian War. He spent a year in Bosnia covering the siege of Sarajevo at the height of the conflict. Julius Strauss. He was served as a war correspondent for 15 years in major conflicts around the world, including Balkans, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, Moscow, and the 2004 Western hostage crisis. He retired in 2006 as a wildlife activist and runs a beer farm in Canada. This year he returned to his profession following the war in Ukraine and events in Russia and the Balkans. So welcome to the speakers and all the guests who have graced us with their presence. We are looking forward to see the start of this discussion. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Thank you for hosting me. This is my first time to this part of the world. It's very interesting. I've been doing a little bit of tourism around this talk. Tomorrow I'll get to do some more, so I'm looking forward to that. You heard that I was a journalist for 20 years. I'm a recovering journalist. I am now a fellow for a policy think tank in Washington, D.C., but in between, for 10 years, I was an intelligence officer that dealt with counterterrorism and the threat of jihadist attack in the United States. This was in the years after 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. I worked in what's called a fusion center, one of the largest in the United States, for the Texas Department of Public Safety, which is a multi-billion-dollar state police agency. And we worked together in one secure facility with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and DEA and CIA and many of our federal partners together so that we would not have another intelligence failure due to a lack of communication, which is the hallmark of the 9/11 attacks, which was that it was an intelligence failure. The reason I say this is because I worked for 10 years doing this job with federal security clearance. I learned a great deal about terrorism and counterterrorism, and people deserve to know the background of those who would pretend to instruct them on subjects like this. So that's why I bring that up. The time that I spent doing this work, very often there would be eruptions every couple of years between Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah, shorter, less intense wars. And every time that this happened, people in my world would work nights and weekends for sometimes weeks at a time because of so much threat information coming. People in the United States, if they were Jewish, would be very fearful of attack by immigrants, usually Arabs, who would be maybe very emotionally involved in whatever was happening. Our job was to know about this information and try to prevent attack.
and we worked very closely for many hours a day until the wars were over and we could go back to normal. I'm no longer in this business, obviously, but I know that because of what's happening again over there, that American intelligence is going to be very tense right now, spending a lot of hours, a lot of days, a lot of weeks working on threat problems that will result inevitably from the war. People are emotionally involved in this war. I think that there is no question if you watch the media in the United States, but also throughout Europe, through the European theater. And so because of that, I guess we agreed that this might be a good topic to discuss today because you are already hearing a lot of news saturation. You're seeing news saturation about threats, about the war, about things happening in the streets. So we decided that maybe a good topic would be to discuss something about the background of the origin story, I guess, maybe the origin story of Islamist jihadism and terrorism. Now, I personally don't like the term terrorism. I think there's pejorative judgment embedded in the use of the term terrorism, because if I am the one that is pursuing a cause against somebody, that somebody will call me the terrorist. And if those guys are pursuing the cause against me, I'm the terrorist, they're the terrorist, who's the terrorist? There's a pejorative that's associated with that. However, I do like to call this kind of violence political violence. And I think that the term political violence is more applicable to this situation and any other situation when we start to see attacks in European cities, attacks in US cities, which we are seeing more of now. The Islamic threat, we call that terrorism in the United States, and also in the EU, they call it terrorism because Western societies and Western democracies are usually the targets of this kind of political violence. Our societies are the targets very often for reasons that are often ideological and religious and ideological at the same time. I thought maybe I would just spend a few minutes explaining that. We've agreed to just maybe take 10 minutes or so each, and then we can keep going from there. So I hope you'll have some questions. One thing that I would tell you is that even though Todd Bensman does not like the term terrorism, my government and the EU countries all use this term for legal reasons as a way to define the political violence and to paint an enemy of our societies. So we do define terrorism. The United States government defines terrorism in about 20 different ways. Even our own agencies can't really agree on the best definition of terrorism, and neither can the EU. Nobody really agrees on the definition, but there are some common themes to the definition here and in the United States and in Australia and all the Western, what we call the Five Eyes, which is to say that it must involve threats or actual violence that would result in bodily injury and up to death by a state, a sub-state actor, not a nation, a sub-state actor or a non-state actor, with the objective in mind that there will be political outcome, political change, some kind of social or political change as the result. Now, this definition does not only apply to Islamic Jihad, it also applies to any kind of domestic terrorism. If it's a non-state actor, if they are killing, they have the capability to kill, and it's for a political cause, then it can be defined as terrorism legally. Why do we want to define terrorism legally? It gives us the opportunity to bring to bear the full weaponry in our arsenals to attack that enemy. What I mean by that is we can suppress our enemy through the banking system, through taking sanctions on companies and people for providing material support to the designated enemy. And we can bring to bear, when we define a target as terrorism designated, we can bring our military to bear. We can shoot Hellfire missiles from a CIA drone when we do that, but not otherwise. We can also bring surveillance and intelligence collection from a nation-state power position against our enemies. In other words, when we declare somebody a terrorist, designated terrorist enemy, under the definitions that I've described, we can attack them with the full force of our military and intelligence apparatus. And one last thing is that domestically we can prosecute in a special way with enhanced penalties when we define an enemy as a terrorist, as terrorism. Now, the majority of designated terrorist entities, from the United States perspective, and I think also from the European perspective, are Islamists. They're jihadists, they're Islamic jihadists. Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization. Al-Qaeda, ISIS. None of this is a surprise, or should be a surprise to you, but who are they? What is the ideology? Why have we designated them a terrorist organization? From my journalism background, I take my cues for their ideology because, I'm obviously a non-Muslim, a white man living in the United States. Who am I to tell you what their ideology is? So I don't pretend to tell you from my opinion. I take my information from them. Their manifestos, the court cases where we see the published wiretaps, the transcripts of the wiretaps, from their public pronouncements, from their propaganda magazines, from their social media, from a very wide and diverse and deep source of information, which is them. This is an incredibly valuable tool. I think this is something that students and academia and media, and we certainly did it in the intelligence business, is that we listen to them and we pay close attention and we believe them. Why shouldn't we? Because it's consistent information over a long period of time. What are the 3 or 4 common themes of radical Islamism? And I say Islamism because Islamism is something it's political. Islamism is something that's different than terrorism. They're not the same thing, but terrorist activity or political violence often emanates from political Islamism. And political Islamism is this idea that the state, that the administrative, an administrative nation state should meld with the religion into one entity. That is Islamism. It's something that dates back to the 13th century, but in more recent years to the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt and its early leaders in Egypt, Sayyid Qutb Hassan al-Banna. You can look them up. Their writings, very, very influential from the late, especially starting in the early 1980s, late 1970s, for different reasons. But the 3 or 4 common elements of their ideology is, number one, we want to establish an Islamic caliphate, re-establish the Islamic caliphate from that was disbanded in 1928 by the new secular Turkish government of that post-World War I era. And we want to return Islam to its golden era of the Mohammedan period of conquest, after which there were great advances in science and math and literature and art in the Islamic world. This strand of Wahhabist sort of Islamism on the Sunni side holds that over the years, Islam was degraded by its enemies to a primitive, to return Islamic societies and culture to a primitive pre-Muhammad state. And therefore, we must commit jihad in order to reverse these fortunes, eliminate our enemies on consecrated Muslim land in the immediate vicinity of the conquests of the 7th century. That includes Israel. Israel may not exist in this ideology because that land is consecrated Muslim lands that cannot be ruled scripturally by non-Muslim peoples, ever. That is the key thing. So the caliphate reestablishes in the near war, in present-day Israel and the Arab countries around it. I know I'm past. I think the hook's coming out, but the caliphate that they wish to reestablish, they kind of did. ISIS tried to do this just a few years ago. They declared the caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and kind of tried to hold on to it. They were defeated ultimately militarily, but what they did there was perfectly in line with this ideology that comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They plan to expand it. Number two, that everybody who lives within this caliphate will live under Sharia law, which is a cradle to grave code of living that we all know about. You can go look it up on your own. I'm not going to tell you all about that, but Sharia law, just like in the ISIS caliphate, they tried to have Sharia law. This is all part of this ideology. And number three is that scripturally, you are obligated in this ideology, this violent ideology, to wage a defensive, offensive war against your oppressors. So if the British are flying and the French are flying air raids against the caliphate, then you are obliged by scripture to attack the British and the French and the Americans and everybody else. And so all of these attacks that you see are part of this scriptural requirement. those are the three main things. It doesn't really matter what the group is, in my opinion, that if you study Boko Haram in Nigeria, they have these 3 or 4 things. If you study Hamas, they have the 3 or 4 things on the Sunni side. If you study Abu Sayyaf, it's the same. Al-Qaeda, it's the same. They all have the same 3 or 4 common codes of their ideology that require them to attack in a defensive, because their view is that they are under siege. So when you start to see attacks, look for what they're saying, what they're telling the police, what they're put on their social media. You will always see these 3 or 4 things. And I can just, there's obviously much more to this than 10 minutes of me talking about it. So I tried to distill something kind of simple for you on that.
One thing I agree with Todd on is that I don't like the word terrorism. For me, it's just a fairly meaningless word. It's what we use for our enemies. Todd and I were talking over lunch about some of the definitions of terrorism, and one of them he pointed out was that it has to be a non-state actor. I mean, for me, that kind of, it floors the entire definition of terrorism. I don't see why a non-state actor should be called a terrorist while a state actor is not called a terrorist. And I'm not particularly thinking about the Middle East here. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff that Russia is doing in Ukraine, it doesn't seem qualitatively different than some of the stuff that terrorists do in different parts of the world. I think Todd and I both started out as field reporters, and I stayed a field reporter. I was a field reporter for about 15 years, and I covered a lot of wars, and I spent a lot of time in the Muslim world. And I was in Afghanistan, I was in Iraq, I was in Iran briefly, I was in Jordan, I was in different Muslim countries. And one of the problems, I think, with looking at these countries through the prism of terrorism is it leaves you the impression that somehow these organizations have a high level of legitimacy amongst the people who they claim to represent. What is inevitable is that when things get bad, when the killing starts, when people are dying in their thousands, then these terrorist organizations gain more popularity than when they're not. If there was a poll done in Gaza just before the recent war started with Israel, and roughly 33% of people said they supported Hamas. This is Palestinians in Gaza. The current number, which was done about a week ago, is 76%. So what you find is that violence enhances the legitimacy of terrorist organizations. Now, does it matter how that violence is administered? Yeah, it does matter. And does it matter how legitimate it is? That matters too. But one thing, you guys are at the front of my course this week. You know, one thing that I'm fascinated by as a field reporter is we kind of go through this endless cycle of doing the same thing again and again and again. So let's look at a little bit at modern Islamic terrorism. We start off with Al-Qaeda or the roots of Al-Qaeda, let's say, in Afghanistan during the Jihad against the Soviets. We called them in those days the Mujahideen, and we didn't really differentiate. We differentiated a little bit between Afghans and non-Afghans. We funded them, by the way. We paid for them. The Americans paid for them, and the Saudis paid for them. And the other Western governments were complicit too, including the British government. So we created the seeds of what went on as soon as the Jihad was over, in fairly sort of typical style. We just walked out and left the whole place full of weapons and full of money, and that created the seeds of what became Al-Qaeda on the international front and what ultimately became the Taliban on the domestic front. So for a while we ignored the problem we'd created because we had other priorities, and at a certain point, Al-Qaeda started attacking Western interests, specifically US interests. And that kind of woke up the Western world, at least those who were paying attention to the threat, but the average person still wasn't really aware of what was going on. And then we had 9/11, where the heavens collapsed upon us in a kind of a psychological sense. And suddenly we woke up to the threat of Islamic terrorism. Now, 15 out of 19 of the suicide bombers who did 9/11 were Saudi Arabian. They weren't Hamas, they weren't Hezbollah, they weren't ISIS, they were Saudis. They were Saudis, which is a government that we have been funding for decades and decades and decades through our oil purchases. Without going into too much detail, in 1979, the two things happened. There was the Iranian Revolution. The other thing that happened was that Islamic terrorists took over Mecca. And part of the resulting social deal after that, or political deal, was that the Saudi government agreed to put hundreds of billions of dollars into exporting Wahhabi ideology around the world. And Wahhabi ideology is at the basis of Al-Qaeda, it's at the basis of ISIS, and it's at the basis of a lot of radical Sunni Islamic terrorism. We didn't do anything to Saudi Arabia. We decided that was kind of okay because they were our guy. So if you had to name one country in the world that is the biggest supporter of terrorism, you could make an argument that it's Iran, but you'd probably have to come down on the Saudis. And yet we still continue to cooperate to this day with the Saudis quite happily. Meanwhile, we've smashed our way through Iraq, we've bombed Syria, we're smashing our way, Israel is smashing its way through Gaza right now. So we keep hitting this sort of eruptions of discontent, the eruptions of people who have been put in a situation where they feel they are extremely desperate and they don't have any other option, and yet we don't go to the root of the problem. And this is one of the problems. This is one of the reasons I have a problem with the word terrorism, because if I have a machine gun and you have a knife, you are not going to stand at the other end of the room and say, let's go for it and see who wins. You're going to find another way to attack. You're going to have to find another way to attack, or you're going to die in that process. So in purely non-judgmental evolutionary terms, you're going to find another way to hit me. Now, if that means using human shields, or if that means using suicide bombers, or if that means using children as hostages, and these are all things that Hamas has done. I'm not praising Hamas for 1 second. They are, by any definition, a terrorist organization, to my mind. We shouldn't be surprised if we put them into that initial position where they just do not have too many options. Now, how does a terrorist organization work within its own community? It works by gaining legitimacy, and the tactics of insurgency have not changed in the last, certainly not in the last decades. What do? You are an organization that has marginal or minority support within your own community, and you're a radical organization. What is your tactic? You hit the enemy and you hope that they overreact. And if they do overreact, you gain in strength. And this is true of the Kosovo Liberation Army. This is true of the Taliban. This is true of Hamas. This is true of the situation in Iraq, first Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then later on ISIS. You try and provoke a response. In Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq bombed Shia mosques in order to get that response, in order to provoke an overreaction amongst the Shia that would then justify Sunnis joining their organization. Put yourself into somebody else's shoes for a minute. What if you are a moderate Sunni in Iraq? You've got a government in Baghdad run by Maliki at the time, sponsored by the US, who is killing Sunnis all over the map on one side, and then you've got ISIS on the other side, and you have no other options. You simply do not have another viable political or even social option. You can emigrate if you can get out. So one thing that I find deeply kind of dispiriting is watching these cycles go through again and again and again. And, you know, everything Todd said is absolutely right. but I've spent the last 20, whatever it is, 30 years now. I've also worked, by the way, for the British government and the US government briefly in Afghanistan for about 9 months. So I've seen it from both sides, but I've seen us treat this problem as a counterterrorism problem, as a policing problem, as a security problem, and then go in and make the same mistakes again and again and again and expect a different result. So these things are all of interest. What do we call a terrorist? What is terrorism? How does it work? What do we do against terrorism? And they're sure as hell of interest if we're being targeted ourselves. You know, you didn't want to be on a bus in London on 7/7. You certainly didn't want to be in New York on 9/11. But these are, for me, the problem with it is that we're sticking plasters onto a bleeding body, and it's not going to stop the problem. In fact, we seem not able to learn the lessons of the past, and we just do this again and again. And one of the things that has come out of the current Israeli-Hamas situation is Biden, who by all accounts, or not by all accounts is the wrong word, who any which way you look at him is fairly pro-Israeli, and he always has been pro-Israeli, is cautioning Israel and saying, look, we made these mistakes after 9/11. We were angry, we were emotional, we were upset. It didn't work. We couldn't bomb our way out of the situation. We couldn't use airplanes to our advantage. Ultimately, everything backfired. Afghanistan collapsed, Iraq collapsed, and so on and so on. And this is the counsel, as far as we know, that he's been giving to Netanyahu. Don't react emotionally. Don't react from the heart. Think about what you do next. But from everything we're seeing at the moment, the Israelis are doing exactly what the Americans did after 9/11, which is using huge amounts of force to try and solve a problem, but ends up only exacerbating that same problem. You can crush it temporarily, but it comes back better. It comes back bigger and worse. And one thing, if you look at the progression from Al-Qaeda to Al-Qaeda in Iraq to ISIS, they've only become worse. They've become more cruel, more harsh, more uncompromising. Is that because Muslims are inclined to be terrorists? I would argue absolutely not. In fact, the leading suicide bombers in the world are Tamil Tigers. They're not Islamic organizations at all. There are plenty of other people who have used suicide bombing. The PKK, who are a socialist organization, sort of internationalist Marxist organization, also used a lot of suicide bombing. The Tamil Tigers are also, by the way, an internationalist Marxist organization. So suicide bombing is not an Islamic thing. It's used by Islamic radicals, but it's not a fundamentally Islamic thing. So I've kind of rambled around a bit there, and hopefully it'll provoke some different thoughts and different responses. Back to you, Todd.
Well, I'm not sure what the order of battle is here, but I a couple of things about what you said. We're not debating each other. I don't think we fundamentally disagree. I do acknowledge the frustration about what to do to suppress the ideology of jihadist ideologies that continually morph into other groups with maybe more vigor and greater destructive capacity. And it is a frustrating thing, but I do think that the first order of business is to recognize that Islam as a general whole is not the root cause of these attacks and these problems. That it is a minority strand of ideology within Islam. I think you mentioned it earlier, within Sunni Islam. We have to distinguish between Shia and Sunni, which is Wahhabism, which is a very strict constructionalist way of reading the scriptures, Quranic scriptures and the hadiths, and interpreting them in the way that I've described, which is these three things: caliphate, golden age, return to the golden age, and to have a siege mentality. They're attacking us, they're attacking us, they're attacking us, so therefore we are now obliged to attack back. Those, and also this idea of we must rule our own consecrated lands, our own consecrated lands. That is an ideology that is persistent and tenacious, because Islamic reformers, people that would reform and work on that problem within Islam, are often killed trying. One of the biggest targets of this extremist branch of Islam are the reformers, are the ones that would have institutional change that would isolate and vanquish these relatively few armed groups that can create so much chaos. And I think that the way forward has to be multi-pronged, which has to include military opposition by Western targets, by those that would be. I think that you mentioned the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers, they're not an Islamist, they weren't an Islamist terrorist organization, but they are a good representative case study of an organization that was very persistent for many, many years and successful in Sri Lanka against the majority Sinhalese. Is that right? The Sinhalese majority, until they were militarily defeated. And I mean, it was brutal what they did. In 2009, the majority Sinhalese managed to mount military offensives, get the remaining Tamil Tigers in a pocket, and they surrounded them by artillery and destroyed every last one of them with artillery. That went on for months and months. It was brutal. But the Tamil Tigers are no more, except maybe on websites, and there's some social media about them. ISIS, the ISIS Caliphate in Syria and Iraq, military pressure on that organization destroyed them militarily. Yes, there's a website, there's maybe some pockets in here and there, but they no longer really present a threat to the U.S. homeland, or really to France anymore, or the UK. So I do believe that there has to be military pressure, and it has to be prolonged and persistent and tenacious. But at the same time, there has to be support somehow to the reformers in that religion to change the fact that there are armed groups that keep popping up, trying to get their caliphate, trying to eliminate Israel. The issue with the basic root cause of the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, and Israel and all the other groups, really is the fact that Israel exists. And if Israel is going to continue to exist, you will always have those groups trying to destroy it militarily, because their scriptures tell them to do it. So there has to be reform somehow, in a way, and military pressure on those groups. But the reform part is the tricky part. The military part, I think, is the easy part. Because I do believe Israel probably will end up destroying to the last man Hamas, and then their Mossad will go on an international campaign to kill their leaders wherever they are. But there will be some new Hamas, so they'll call something else, and then they'll have this problem in another 10 or 20 years. So
a few points there I'd like to pick up on. I see the emphasis as being slightly different in that I think you have to win the population over, which can be extremely difficult. And I'm not a pacifist. If you get hardliners who will not reconcile, then perhaps you do have to use military force against them. But you have to win the population over first. And we've been doing it the other way around. We actually did see something that came quite close to success from the Americans in Iraq, which was the surge in 2005-ish to 2008, let's say. And the Americans actually put more soldiers in, when the insurgency was at its height. They put more soldiers into Iraq, which was totally counterintuitive. George Bush sent them in under advice of David Petraeus, who was military intellectual soldier, let's put it that way. And it kind of succeeded. The reason it succeeded is because they gave the Sunnis an option. They paid $400 million in salaries to Sunni rebels, to Sunni insurgents to come over to their side. Now, was that going to last forever? No, it couldn't have lasted forever, but it did bring the level of violence down by 95% in Iraq at the time. The problem is, having done that, having gone to all that effort, we then, the Americans mainly, I'm not trying to say this because Todd is American, but they're just the biggest power in the world. But the West, particularly Obama in this case, basically said, I have no more interest in Iraq. Maliki is in charge. He's a Shia. We know he's killing a few Sunnis here and there. Let's hope for the best. We're pulling out all our political analysts, and as soon as we can, we're going to pull out American troops. And he pulled out American troops in 2011. The only reason it took so long was that George Bush had committed them to stay until 2011. So what you had was an invasion, a massive insurgency, a huge effort, which estimated total cost $2 trillion, and then complete negligence and neglect. And this, for me, is the problem. What did you have during the Jihad, the Soviet-Afghan War? You had exactly the same thing. You had this huge engagement, massive amounts of money, American money, Saudi money. The Mujahideen were armed to the teeth. Who did we arm in the Mujahideen? We armed the Islamic nutters, by the way. We didn't arm the regular guys. We allowed the Pakistanis to choose a slate of the most radical Islamists that there were, and those are the guys we pumped the guns into. And then, as soon as the Soviets pulled out, we dropped it, and we walked away, and we said, ciao, Afghanistan no longer a problem, till 9/11. So we have to have a more long-term approach to this. And while there may be a place for violence, the real progress can only be made when you separate the hardliners from the population. And that's a very difficult thing to do in somebody else's country. When I worked in Afghanistan in 2011, I was on a British government contract, but I worked with the US Marines. And I worked in counterinsurgency. And the counterinsurgency is designed to do exactly that. It's designed to tell the people that we are better than the alternative. In this case, the Afghan government is better than the Taliban. They will rule you in a better way than the Taliban, and to win over popular support. It's very, very difficult to do, but it is possible to do. I think the Tamil Tigers, the fate of the Tamil Tigers is an exception. I don't think that works. It did in that case, I agree, but it doesn't usually work, and it's not going to work with the Palestinians in Gaza. It's sure as hell not going to work with the Sunnis in Iraq and Syria. There are a hell of a lot of them, and they've been through a really, really rough time. What we have to do, if we're going to be involved in those countries at all, and if we're not, then we're not, but we can't keep going in and busting up all the furniture. What we have to do is to offer both Shia and Sunni some politically moderate way forward. They basically want the same things that we want. They don't want to go around blowing themselves up. They don't want violence. They don't want their kids being killed every 5 minutes. They want some kind of security. They want their kids to go to school. They want to be able to afford to go shopping. Just the same things that everybody else wants. And I think the only way to do that is through counterinsurgency, but I do accept that counterinsurgency is very difficult. The thing with ISIS and the caliphate, I think, Todd is right. They do, these organizations do aim to have a caliphate, but how many of them, the irony here is that as soon as they have a piece of land to defend, we can bomb the hell out of them. When they don't have a piece of land to defend, we can't. This is why Al-Qaeda in Iraq was more successful in a way than ISIS, because ISIS gave us an area of vulnerability to attack. We sent in our heavy weapons and we smashed them to bits. By the way, I think that if we don't give the Sunnis in Iraq and Syria any options, ISIS is coming straight back in some other form. It might be 2 years, it might be 5 years, I don't know. But we haven't solved that problem in any way at all. We've got Bashar al-Assad in, a Shia, I don't know, nice word to use for Assad, but a Shia butcher in Syria, and we've got a Shia-led government, a pro-Iranian, by the way, Shia-led government that we facilitated into power in Iraq. So the Sunnis are still feeling marginalized. So when somebody comes along, and not even talking about Israel, so when someone comes along from Hamas or ISIS or whatever and says, you know what, I don't know if you like us or not, but we will protect you, or we'll try and protect you, it's a powerful message. It's a powerful message to give them. We have to take away that message. None of us in this room like Hamas or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any of these organizations, but we have to delegitimize them. We can't just keep smashing them to pieces and expect the aspiration and the politics behind it to change. There's one other thing, and this I do disagree with Todd on. I don't think the problem with Israel is that it exists. I think we had a settlement there's a lot of problems because Israel exists, and there's a lot of pissed off Arabs because Israel exists. I accept that entirely. But we were very close to a settlement 20 years ago. The Israelis basically agreed to stop settlements in the West Bank, and they've not only continued, I looked up the numbers before this because I was kind of curious just how, it's something you hear about a lot, but you don't always know the facts. In 1977, there were 4,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. Today, there are 500,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. The settlement program has gone absolutely, what I don't want to use an emotional word for it, has gone viral, if you like. It's just multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And this, for me, is the cause root of why the Palestinians are losing faith, because they're seeing their future country, the land that they felt was promised to them 20 years ago, disappearing as the years go by. That's why they're losing faith in their own authorities as well. They're losing faith in the Palestinian Authority. And along comes Hamas and says, we might not be able to get your land back, but we'll send you straight to heaven with however many virgins. And suddenly that becomes a decent proposition, when it shouldn't be a decent proposition. Now, I understand the Israeli point of view as well on this. After the two-state deal came up as a serious possibility, the Intifada started, the Palestinians were upset, they were blowing themselves up, there was suicide bombing and so on and so on. And a lot of Israelis turned around and said, you know what, we can go for a two-state solution and we're not going to get the security that we want. But I would argue there is no alternative to the two-state solution. We're not looking for perfect solutions here. There is no alternative. And I was in Israel last time in February, and I have to say, other than for the sort of center-left, slightly older politicians, the Israelis I spoke to basically said, you know what, screw the Arabs. They're not getting anything from us. We have the technology, we have the security to make sure they cannot hit us. They're not going to get anything from us, so let's forget about the two-state solution. There's no reason for us to make concessions. And I say with no happiness at all, I mean, I have no joy at all in what Hamas managed to do. But I do think that it was, maybe not in military terms, but in ideological terms, it was an inevitable result of this kind of process that's been going on for the last 20 years.
So much. At least we're not beating around the bush. So much there. Hello? Yeah, okay. So there is on Yale Law School's website, they have something called the Avalon Project, Avalon, the Avalon Project, Yale Law School. And there you can find the Hamas Covenant. This is their manifesto from 1988, translated into English, and meeting the highest standards of translation by the law school there. So you can read in this manifesto, what is it that Hamas wants? Well, nowhere in this manifesto will you ever see something called a two-state solution. There is only one solution that they talk about in the covenant, and that is a one-state solution, which is a caliph state where present-day Israel is, and nothing more ever. And in fact, I would challenge anybody in this room to find some public statement by some Hamas representative over the last 25, 30 years where they said they would like a second state next to a Jewish Israel state. You'll never find it because that's not what they want. They want something very different. And they tell you exactly what they want in this covenant document. So you can go look that up yourself. There's also a section in there about peace treaties and peace negotiations and where they stand on that, which is that there will be none ever until the day of judgment, is how they put it. There will only be perpetual jihad until the day of judgment, or until the Zionist entity no longer exists. When you think about the war, yes, there are the Israeli settlements that are expanding, but you will never hear Hamas complain about those. Never. That's not or checkpoints, or brutality, or anything. Just this one thing, that this place exists. It's non-Muslims ruling on a piece of consecrated Muslim land. I put that in air quotes, but that's what they say. Anyway, aside from that, I do agree that there needs to be, that the only solution is a two-state solution, because, what else are you going to do? Have perpetual war? But this brings us back again to the military option and the option of reform. The Catholic Church has had moments of reformation. The Lutherans, the Methodists, every major religion has had a reform internally in its religion, except one of the major Abrahamic religions, and that's Islam. It has not yet had a reformation because it's not really organized that way. Plus, you have a split between Shia and Sunni, and there's a lot of reasons why there has not been a reformation. But in that particular part of the world, but also all around the world, because you can't really kill an idea. You can't kill an idea. And you can kill ISIS and its caliphate, and you could kill the Tamil Tigers, but their idea probably continues on, even the Tamils, about independence and a separate state on the island there. But you have to figure out a way to get to reform, to where the world of Islam is the one that manages to isolate and destroy this Wahhabist movement and ideology. It's really not that old. I believe that it can be done because it kind of dates to within maybe 100 years, in the 1920s, when the Qutb and Albano popularized this idea of Islamism, political Islamism. The state and Islam shall be one. Of course, it's the opposite in modern democracies. We separate religion and state on purpose because we know of the evils that have happened in the past when religions and states are together. So we have separation of religion and state in the United States embedded in the Constitution. This idea of political Islamism is anathema to Western thought and liberal values. So you're going to have a problem always having Western institutions involved in some kind of Islamic reformation. It has to come from within, but maybe there are some ways that we can encourage and facilitate this. Now, in the meantime, because I know how frustrating it is, the Israelis call it mowing the lawn. They mow the lawn that gets too big, too grassy and weedy in Gaza and on the West Bank, etc. So they'll have to go in militarily and mow the lawn, knowing it's going to grow back sooner or later. But that doesn't mean that you don't mow the lawn. I can think of many wicked problems, and this is a wicked problem, this ideology to resolve. Doesn't mean that you don't continually apply pressure to it. I've used this example before. Pedophilia, rape. There are all kinds of human problems that are wicked problems. You're not going to solve pedophilia ever, maybe, but you can manage it down. You can pressure always on it. You can put those guys in prison every time you find them. You can make them run and hide and not commit the crime because they're afraid of being killed or going to prison or something else. So there still has to be this pressure in the meantime while we're working on reform, encouraging reform. I don't think the reform can come from our side.
I mean, pedophilia actually... Pedophilia is a good example because if there's a pedophile in a village, you don't flatten the village, you take out the pedophile. And I wouldn't have a problem with Israel taking out Hamas selectively, especially high-value Hamas commanders. But I have a huge problem with this idea that you take out collective punishment against the Palestinians in Gaza because of the actions of Hamas. The other thing that really irritates me is I think that Hamas is getting exactly what they want. Hamas, if before 2 months ago, the whole Israel-Palestine thing was almost off the international political agenda. There was no talk at all of a two-state solution. It was considered dead in the water. All the Arab countries, if you look at them individually, they all had something else going on. And this actually is something that might help Israel in the present circumstance, because Syria does not want a war with Israel. Egypt does not want a war with Israel. Jordan doesn't want a war with Israel, all for different reasons. Saudi doesn't want to break ties with Israel, or at least it doesn't want to slow down its increasingly warm ties with Israel. And Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, I totally accept that, has somehow, through this one act, turned the entire Middle East on its head. I would argue that we're giving Hamas exactly what it wants. It may die in the process, but Hamas is a death cult anyway. It's always been that. It's always glorified death. There's nothing new in that for Hamas operatives. So I'm not defending Hamas. What I'm doing, essentially, if we're making value judgments, and we kind of said we wouldn't at lunch, but there you go, is criticizing this kind of inconsistent Western policy application in the Middle East. The Middle East has plenty of problems that have nothing to do with the West. I'm not disputing that either. It's just that we're making things worse and worse. I know we're kind of running out of, we should be into question time by now, shouldn't we? So maybe I'll stop there and we'll go over to questions from the audience. Were you reminding me? I'm not quite sure. I had a stern look from this lady here.
Anyways, so the question is to both of you. Yes, my assessment as a layman is too that essentially this Hamas stuff just put an end to the renormalization, renormalization that Israel tried to do with the Arab world. What would be a solution, essentially, if they don't want the reforms? Seeing that the Americans and the West did a 20-year-old nation-building project in Afghanistan, and it crumbled in 1 or 2 days, $20 trillion spent, nation built, crumbled. if they don't want to democratize and to accept Western values, or just to essentially do a reform, and if we agree that imperialism is bad, why keep the money sink and the time sink and the effort?
Can I take it first? Yeah. I don't. This one on? Is that on? Yeah. I mean, I think this is a sort of a Western hubris that they want liberal Western values. They don't want liberal Western values. The fight in the Islamic world is between Islamism and Arab nationalism. Liberalism has never even got onto the scale. The Middle East is a complicated, fractured, flawed, violent place. Us doing everything right from tomorrow on in is not going to solve that, certainly not in the short term. But it might improve things in the long term. Us doing everything wrong is definitely going to make it worse. So I don't think there's an easy fix here. I do think on the Israel-Gaza thing, there is a way forward, and it is the two-state solution, and it's not going to be signed tomorrow or even next year. But giving the Palestinians some kind of hope for the future, that somewhere along the line, if it's 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, we are all working towards that, and they believe in that process, I think would take a lot of legitimacy away from Hamas. Not this week, it won't, because there's just too much dying and killing going on. But with time, it will. You re-energize the Palestinian Authority or somebody else that replaces it, and that's the best show in town. That's the best we have to offer. Is it going to be perfect and quick and whatever? No, absolutely not. But what is the alternative? The alternative is to spend huge amounts of money, kill huge amounts of people, smash up all the buildings every 5 years, and then pull out again, which is what we've been doing up to now. And the one thing with mowing the lawn, the British Army used this expression as well, mowing the lawn. I would argue that the Israelis are not mowing the lawn now in Gaza. Mowing the lawn is a few strikes, kill a few people. It's what happens every 3 years in Gaza. I think this is probably something a little bit, this is more like napalming the lawn.
Yeah, I would agree. This is beyond mowing the lawn. This is something different, and it will be interesting to see the post-war model that emerges from this. But I will say that Western societies and Western nations are terrible at nation building. I think the last successful example was the Marshall Plan in 1945, and that was aimed at countries like the United States-ish, where you had Western democracies with liberal values and common recollection of philosophical foundations for capitalism and things like this. So I think what will have to happen is some kind of nation building. I don't know who's going to do this or how it's going to develop, but it's definitely going to be interesting to watch. The lawn is not being mowed right now. It is being irradiated. So there will be an opportunity for something maybe new and maybe potentially positive. But I will point out one thing, that if it is not positive, another group emerges and starts building tunnels and using the aid it gets to manufacture rockets and tunnels and things, that oddly, the nation of Israel managed to find a way to prosper even in a perpetual state of war, a perpetual state of having to mow the lawn. Their GDP more than doubled in the last 10, 15 years, weirdly, in a state of war. And this was kind of like it became a Silicon Valley type country, incredibly prosperous with the discovery of massive oil and natural gas on the coast, and all sorts of, like, a space program. They're putting satellites up, and they have a working Supreme Court and a working democracy where the Arab citizens seem to be supportive more of the Israeli army and the Israeli side than you would ever expect. So it's possible that they could live with a perpetual state of war while they're waiting for this magical reform seed to take root. If it doesn't take root in the irradiated garden this time, I think for the Israelis, they're willing to live with it because they have only prospered.
The Supreme Court might not be the best
Yeah,
example.
I know. I got the Supreme Court.
I have Oh yeah, sorry. One more thing. From what I see as a layman is that the unstoppable force met the immovable object. Both sides have irreconcilable conflicts. If we take a look at the extremist sides and the Israeli side, they want to exist. The extremists want them gone. If all our actions just adds fuel to the fire, aid is spent not on infrastructure but on rockets, why do Western democracies still keep involved in the region? If all our actions just makes it worse, let them sort it out. That's my opinion. Sorry.
Well, right now it's a very one-sided conflict. We can let them sort it out, but at some point, I mean, first of all, we are engaged in the Middle East. We give Israel large amounts of military support and financial support. There are aid programs for the Palestinians. I don't know if you speak to an Israeli economist what the Israeli economy would look like without that support. I think certainly at the moment they would struggle because they're in the midst of a very expensive military campaign. I think to answer that question very briefly, what we need is some level of consistency. There's that great saying, the Americans came up with it, if you break it, you own it. But if you don't break it in the first place, you can manage it. You can somehow manage it, deal with the problem. It's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect. But if you just look at the history of the Middle East, what you've got, look at the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. We supported Iraq. And then we decided Iraq was the bad guys because they went into Kuwait. And then we took out Saddam Hussein. And then we hate the Iranians, but we supported a Shia government into power that was pro-Iranian. And then the Iranians started killing Westerners, and we're like, why the hell are they doing that? And why are they facilitated by their local allies? And then ISIS popped up. We're like, oh, we better crush them quickly. We're just kind of bouncing around in a kind of a policy. I mean, this is like policy Brownian motion. It's just nuts. There's no consistency. There's not even a medium-term vision. And yet we're pouring in huge amounts of money. I know that's not entirely an answer to your question, but I think that we have such a high level of engagement already that a studied disengagement might work. But the idea that we just run out and shut the door, which, by the way, we did in Iraq in 2011, and you saw what happens next. If you create chaos and hatred and revolution and fundamentalism and all these things, you can't leave halfway through the football match. I know we'd like to, it's easier, but we've seen what happens. We saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq. We've probably seen it in other places as well.
Thank you. My name is Daniel, and I'm a student of the MCC. My question is, when can you tell, or rather, how can you measure if a terrorist organization is destroyed or not? Or can you do that at all or not?
Yeah, I think so. Probably the best way to measure whether a terrorist organization's capability have been reduced is the frequency and number of attacks or attempted attacks. So, for example, after 9/11, the United States put the full force of its military might and intelligence services and war machine to target Al-Qaeda, and they were reduced to a point where people remember or forget rather that the 9/11 attack was actually the last final culmination of a long series of attacks that came first overseas. The USS Cole, the embassy bombings in Africa, and some other ones along the way. and that this was sort of the last of a series of major Al-Qaeda attacks, which, by the way, were the main demand was that the American army was in Saudi Arabia on holy consecrated Muslim ground and had to be removed, and that these attacks would continue until the U.S. Army was removed from Saudi Arabia, Mecca, the land of Mecca. That was number one for Al-Qaeda. But then I think we saw that Al-Qaeda was significantly reduced in number. We killed their operatives everywhere. We hellfired, missiled them to death out of existence. And then eventually we took some years, but eventually, by the time we killed Osama bin Laden, Navy SEAL, they weren't really a threat to us anymore. Al-Qaeda had not been conducting any kind of significant attacks against the U.S. homeland for maybe ever. There might have been some inspired lone offenders, but for the most part, even the jihadis were disappointed, and were far more fired up by the new ISIS, which actually declared a caliphate, the thing that the central thing that they all want. And so then you started to see Europeans in droves go to join them, and even in from the U.S., from all over the world, they were so excited they went to join them. But the campaign, military intelligence, everything else that we applied against ISIS prevented really them from ever conducting anything on the U.S. homeland. They were able to infiltrate over the European Union borders, organized cells that attacked in France in November 2015, and in Brussels in March of 2016, and some other organized attacks, lots of gun battles in the streets, big firefights all over France and Germany, etc. But after that, the Europeans really started to apply their military and intelligence muscle, so that now it's just maybe some stabbings, some inspired stabbings here and there, but not very many very well organized ones. And so I think that's how you judge it. The Israelis are another example of this, where you had different intifada periods. The most recent one in the 2010, I may be wrong about this, that a suicide bombing campaigns from the West Bank, and they built a security barrier and put in extra security, and imprisoned and assassinated their way until the number of attacks inside the homeland went to zero, almost zero. So that's, I think, the way now the ideas are still out there. The ideas will, if we are not careful, will take root again and find always some kind of nutritional soil somewhere and grow. But I do think it's like pedophilia. You have to manage it always. You'll maybe not get rid of it, but you can put enough in jail so that fewer people are victimized.
I mean, I think that counterterrorism might work on a national basis. In other words, America's an island, more or less. Don't tell that to the Canadians. And Britain's an island, and counterterrorism can work for those states. But it doesn't stop these people killing Americans abroad or killing Brits abroad. I mean, we've seen huge amounts of Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, huge amounts of Brits killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. So counterterrorism might be, I mean, we can argue about whether it's a sticky plaster or whether it's a tourniquet, but it's certainly not solving the root problems. And I would argue, actually, that this Hamas attack is exactly proof of that. You can put up walls, you can use all kinds of technology, but ultimately, what happens, and there's a sort of almost an inevitability about this, is that eventually the security services slacken off. They become a little bit too comfortable. They haven't had an attack in a while. They start missing the signs. They lose their edge, if you like. They're sometimes very sharp edge. And then they get hit by something like this. And that's kind of what happened in 9/11 in the US. It's a bit more complicated, but it's definitely what happened in Israel right now. I mean, the warning signs were out there a year ahead of time, and the Israelis didn't take it seriously enough. My feeling is that if you want to become an island and protect yourself and put a big wall around yourself, you can probably manage that with providing you're willing to spend the money, with counterterrorism methods. But you're not solving the basic problems. And let's see, because history is a long time. I mean, the Russians also have a very effective counterterrorism apparatus. They just go in and kill absolutely everybody in the vicinity. I work quite a lot in Chechnya. And the Russians at one point were killing women they thought might become suicide bombers on the basis that their husband had died or their brother had died in the Jihad or whatever. They sort of thought, you know what, she's kind of 30 years old and she's lost somebody. Let's just kill her just in case. Well, in the short term, they've won that. They've won that conflict. They have a guy in charge who's their guy. They kind of get what they want. But let's see. Let's see how this thing plays out. Ultimately, really the way to defeat insurgency is through 100 different things. It's good governance, it's good laws, it's a prosperous economy, it's all kinds of different things. When I was in Afghanistan, one of the things I worked on with the US Marines was counter-narcotics. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar thing. It's very difficult to hit counter-narcotics really hard and straight because if you get rid of all the narcotics, the price goes up, the incentives rise, and more people start producing it. So you have to address it through better legal systems, better alternative economic opportunities for the locals, better policing, better this, better that. It's a complicated issue. And I think that, really making things better in terms of international terrorism is a complicated issue. But I accept that counterterrorism can work in a limited environment, or maybe in our own homelands. And maybe sometimes that's all we care about, is what happens, in our own homelands. Problem is, when you get something like, Hamas Israel happening, is that people get upset and they want some kind of different action. And there's a pressure to say, well, it might be happening over there, but we've got to do something about that. Trouble when the ladies are leaving. Yes. Any
cultures, this Islamism is more against the Western side, or even the Chinese on the eastern part of are looked enemy in the eye of this Islamism.
We have to be really careful to generalize. Something like 25% of Americans think that 9/11 was an inside job. Maybe it's 20% now. I think it's been up to 30%. You can't generalize. It's very difficult to generalize about people. If you go to Iran, I've been to Iran as a Westerner, the people love you. They don't like your country. They don't like Britain. They sure as hell don't like America. In fact, they don't like either of them. But they're very personable towards you. And if you talk to them, they'll say, you know what? The problem's not between us. The problem's between those politicians making money and creating wars. So does that make them anti-Western or not? Well, it depends on the context. The other thing is, when we look at countries that are not democratic, when there's not free will, my primary area of expertise really is Russia, Ukraine. And I'm asked a lot, what do Russians think about the war? I can talk about it for an hour, but it's very difficult to actually know because there's not a free expression. How do you judge? You walk up to somebody in the street. How do you know why they're saying what they're saying? in that sense, I mean, one thing I really liked about Israel is that everybody's got an opinion about everything, and they all say it immediately. There's no sort of holding back, and I like that vibrant sort of political culture in Israel. So, you know, talking about Islam with one sweep of the brush is just impossible for me. I've, you know, some of the gentlest, nicest, most forgiving, kind of well-intentioned people I've ever met have been Muslims. They think about their faith deeply. They look at the positives of it. They see a great duty to give to the poor. They have a very, very strong hospitality culture, which we don't really have anymore. And it's encoded in their religion. It's not just, I want to be nice to people. You know, there are things about Islam that are really attractive, applied in a certain way and in certain countries and in certain circumstances. And then there are these nutters going around blowing themselves up for, you know, we had to, when I was in Afghanistan, we had to deal with suicide bombings. And it's crazy. I mean, these were 15-year-old Pakistani kids who were completely illiterate, and they almost had to be sort of, they were almost on remote control. They'd have a handler, and they'd send off this 15-year-old Pakistani, and they'd say, you know, that way, left a bit, right a bit, oh, you idiot, turn around, go back that way. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it's sad, to be honest. It's really sad. I'm going to tell you a very light story, because this has been a very heavy subject so far. I was once in Kabul, and I went into a hospital, and there was a man who'd been injured there, and the Taliban had just left Kabul a few days before. And I said, how did you get injured? And he said, well, can you imagine? I'm a shopkeeper, and I went out into the street, and I see this stupid Pakistani kid. And I say, hey, don't worry, the war is over, you can relax now. He runs up to me, he goes, Allahu Akbar, and he pulls his hand grenade. And I'm the one person trying to help him in the world. So I said, well, what happened? He said, well, the hand grenade bounced a couple of times, and I got a load of shrapnel in me. He didn't die. Neither of them died. And so they both got shrapnel in them. And I said, before I even thought about it, because I'd been talking to other people in the hospital, I said, oh, I know who he is. He's 3 wards down that way. And the guy got up and he said, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. And he set off down the corridor to take out this hapless 15-year-old, 16-year-old Pakistani suicide bomber. I mean, it's a really sad thing on the ground to see. It's effective as a weapon, but it's sad. It's not, when you see these kids, it's difficult to hate them. It's I'm not condoning them in any way at all, but when you see the human side of it, you kind of have a not more sympathy or empathy, but you kind of understand how the process works. And it works through ignorance. It works through, you know, the Pakistani school system is full of madrasas where they take a 5-year-old and all they do is recite the Quran until they're 15, and they call that an education, and they push them out onto the streets. Funded by Saudi Arabia, by the way, a lot of it. So I think, you know, like anything, it's like if I said to you, you know, what do you think about Transylvania? You would go, oh, how do I even begin to answer that question? If you spend a lot of time in Muslim countries, I think you find it difficult to generalize about Islam and Muslims.
Direction to the states of states.
No. The vast majority of victims are Muslims. The vast majority. I mean, Al Qaeda in Iraq pretty much only killed Muslims in the end. Not entirely. No, it's in a lot. Most of it is Shia, Sunni, or different versions. Or most. I mean, the vast majority. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but I would bet that 100 times more Muslims have been killed than non-Muslims by these terror organizations.
Islamic responses to Western aggression towards that. Shall we see similar responses to the Uyghur conflict in northwestern China?
In other words, will the Uyghurs adopt the same tactics?
Or the rest of the Islamic world comes to their aid to them like the IRC does to...
So I'll take a shot at that, because the Uyghur situation it's definitely one of those circumstances that begs very loudly the question of where is everybody on that? How come? Why? I mean, these are concentration camps and labor camps on a mass scale in China. Where are the Muslim defenders of those Muslims? And where are the Western defenders, really, of those Muslims, of which there should be many? Campaigns, for fundraising campaigns, efforts to get them out and pressure the Chinese government with economic sanctions to relent on that. But you don't hear that. You really don't hear much, and it's a great question. But I think that part of the answer, just part, has to do with the fact that Western civilizations, democracies, are open to diversity and that have civil liberties and civil rights regimens that extremists, violent political extremists, can very easily take advantage of to enter and conduct their agenda. We've seen that over and over and over again in all of the Western democracies. China, though, is, as we know, not anything like that. There is nothing to take advantage of in China, and they do not have open doors policies like the Western democracies. You can't cross the Chinese border and declare asylum and be declared, ushered right in and given all these rights, and none of that. And I think that is a part of why you don't see a lot of attacks going on. Maybe there are some, however, that because of the state media control, that we're not hearing about them. But I think it's probably more like it's not a liberal democracy that can be easily exploited by the enemies of those democracies, as we've seen over and over again in right here in Europe, over and over again, attacks after attack after attack by people that just came in over the border.
But we have to decide if we want to live in a Chinese system or a Western system.
I'm not saying that that's a good thing over there.
Should we say something,
questions?
or does somebody else want to say something?
I saw a hand go up.
We're getting the sign that there's not much more time. Should we take one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
last question.
Hi, I'm Gabriela. I'm a colleague at MCC. That's why I'm considerate of the time. I'm just curious how violence makes these organizations more popular. Shouldn't it horrify people? I'm just naive, I admit it, but shouldn't violence horrify people and alienate them?
It doesn't. History shows us that it doesn't. Killing people tends to infuriate those who survive, make them more emotional, more inclined to radical response. Once you get to a certain level of killing, if we're willing to countenance that, that might change. I mean, the Russians in Chechnya, they literally flattened Grozny. I mean, people say they flattened this city and that city. They didn't, believe me. Go to Grozny and you'll see what a flat city looks like. Actually, Gaza's beginning to look a bit flat, especially in the north. But most of the time when people say they flatten a city, it means they damage a city. Sarajevo wasn't flattened during the war, it was damaged. Grozny, they just flattened the entire thing. But don't forget, Russia's a very, very big country. There's less than 1 million Chechens. And they had the military power to just keep smashing and killing until, if necessary, the last one of them ran out. At that point, yeah, then you win. But if you're not prepared to go that far, and I'm not suggesting you do, because I think it's deeply immoral, but if you just keep hurting and hurting and hurting, you're more likely to get a response that is radical. The other thing you have to remember is that a lot of these radical organizations are not very good at running everyday things. They're not very good at parking meters and school teachers, and some of them are okay, but most of them are not very good. So if they're judged in peacetime by the people, their constituents, by the people who live in them, they're probably not going to do as well in terms of popularity. Well, we've seen it with those numbers from Hamas right now. So no, I mean, I could talk about this a lot because there's some very interesting studies from World War II about just how close does a bomb have to fall to you, like how close from you to make you never want to see a bomb again. And if it's just a little bit further away, it will inspire you to ever greater resistance. And there has been studies done on this. But generally speaking, in the modern world, we find that the more we kill, the more hatred we engender.
And I would just add that if we were to look from the perspective of the Wahhabist line of ideology, this strict constructionalist sort of religious political ideology, they say things like, we value death more than you value life, and that's why we will win ultimately. That's why we will get our caliphate and dominate the world, because you are afraid of death, but we cherish death. And that goes to religious scriptural guideposts. For example, suicide in Islam is absolutely forbidden. It's a mortal sin. But martyrdom is the highest attainment of value in Wahhabist thinking. Martyrdom operations is where the attacker dies, is very, very valued. So valued that in places in the Middle East, in the Gaza Strip, and in the West Bank, they name streets after martyrs, children that martyred themselves. The Palestinian Authority funnels payments to the families of those who martyred themselves. They are revered. Their photos are on the walls. They name the streets. They have schools named after the martyrs. Is very, very valued to die in the service of your religious faith. Now, that's just this pretty narrow band, not at all the norm across the religion. But when you're not killing, the question becomes, why aren't you killing? Al-Qaeda was under a lot of criticism within the jihadist community for years. You're not killing enough. ISIS is out killing you. We're going with them. A lot of that we saw in the intelligence business. So it's just, that's the value. It's a cultural value within that ideology.
The only thing I would counter argue is I think we do exactly the same. I think the biggest heroes in Britain, if you look at the Victoria Cross, which is the highest medal for bravery, it's given mostly to people who die in the action of committing that bravery. There's subtle differences between taking your own life, between inevitable death and probable death, but we do also honor. It is different. I'm not trying to say they're exactly the same, because Hamas particularly does have this weird kind of death cult. But we also honor giving up your life in the service of your country in a similar way, I think.
But usually, I would add, usually against armed opposing soldiers.
Yeah. Anyway, we better, we've been waved at a couple of times, so we're going to call it a day there. So thank you for coming, everybody, and hope you've enjoyed our lively discussion.